Thanks very much, Rory. It's a real pleasure to be here. The whole Paulo Freire system, you're all much more steeped in it than me, but listening to the Tibetan singing bowl, it brought me back to my times serving as an altar boy in devotions, that sound. So it shows how stuff sticks with us through our lives, which I suppose is part of the message. So firstly, I want to pass apologies. Minister State Richmond is with a lot of your colleagues today in the DOCUS EU presidency event, where he's going to be setting out the ambitions from the Department of Foreign Affairs from the cooperation perspective in the presidency, which is obviously a really important event. And I'm going to start out with kind of more of a sort of a background story, a bit of an anecdote. I don't have a deep relationship with Paulo Freire, but I did work closely with an organization that was founded on the principles of it in Liberia. I was there 2001, 2003, through Liberia's second civil war, and worked very closely with the Development Education Network Liberia, DANEL. I know it's an organization that several of you here in the room have actually visited, and you've got ongoing partnerships and relationships with. Now, I spent quite a lot of time at the centre. I spent an entire week there, along with the indomitable Sister Miriam, who founded it. And during the day, I was coordinating the evacuation of what turned out to be about 15,000 people who were being held on the one side of the St. Paul's River Bridge in Lofa County, who were being squeezed by rebels and fighting moving south. And we negotiated with the incumbent warlord and moved them through. So that was the day. And at night, sitting with Sister Miriam and the DANEL team, listening to them talk about Paulo Freire, windows of thought, intellectual ideas, and how they were engaging with communities. And it seemed incongruous in a way, given they were 40 kilometers away from the front line, and that their approach was to work as slow-moving educators to try and engage with people whilst there was an actual conflict going on. 6 months later, I was back in DANEL. The day after the sack of Banga, Sister Miriam had been spirited away by a community human shield the night before, surrounded by fighters, and got onto a hand wagon to travel by rail to the coast. And I had to interrupt a small boys unit who were busy looting the place to ask for their help, to load DANEL's papers, their finance, their records into a pickup so that we could help DANEL reconstitute. And I'll never forget the dialogue stopping a 10-year-old who had a Kalashnikov bouncing against the back of his knee. And he was saying, "Oh, boss man, you can't be angry with me. I just take small thing." And he set down the fan he was stealing, gathered together a few of his guys, and helped us, over the space of about an hour, reconstitute DANEL's papers so that DANEL would go back to the gradual work of dealing with what's between people's ears. Because they had the vision that it's thought processes, it's how people interpret, it's how people see their role in society, how they see their ability to affect it, whether they have agency or whether they don't. That would be a determinant over whether or not the future would be chaos or the future would build peace. DANEL went on to play really important work through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Liberia, engaging with communities to ensure that communities' voices were heard. And at the time, again, I struggled a little bit with the immediacy of the humanitarian perspective, the plastic sheeting, wells, foods, medicine. These things were needed, and it was difficult to see how the idea of spending years engaging with the same communities was also part of the process. But clearly it was. Now, that competition for space between the ears, that's essentially your business, our business. And that the efforts and the novel means to compete for that space have never been more challenging than they currently are. And now this is not for anyone to deny the evidence of their eyes, but GCE is about supporting, ensure facts-based thinking to critically interpret what is being witnessed, and to have the basis and tools to understand global justice issues, and enabled to take action to build fairer and more sustainable future for all. You're all in the sector, so you know exactly how it goes and what it is you're trying to achieve. Now in Ireland, you know, we are building from a place of strength. We have a long and proud history of instinctive empathy, compassion toward people in challenging environments, people who share a history of colonialism, oppression, discrimination, injustice, and we have a long history of people's desire and action to work with people in such circumstances, to help right issues of social injustice and to fight extreme poverty. Now, none of us are under any illusion that there's been jolts, unmoorings as regards what has been a broad consensus building really since the end of the 1940s. Recent years have seen mammoth change ideologically, politically, in terms of how many countries view their role in the world and how they view their role vis-a-vis poverty and inequality. As Rory said, Minister Richmond's been clear that where others have stepped back from their commitment to supporting those in need, Ireland has shown unwavering commitment, which continues, and that we've increased our support to furthest behind, increasing our aid budget and humanitarian assistance to its highest ever level. But we were only one of a couple in Europe to do so, and one of only a handful in the world to do so. And clearly, Ireland by itself cannot write and push back on so many challenges. We've seen that there's been a fall of around 23% globally in aid support between 24 and 25, and that's hitting the furthest behind. That's impacting on the ability to support people who are facing crises, like in Ukraine, in Palestine, Sudan, the Greater Horn of Africa, the Sahel, Eastern DRC and the Great Lakes, and the wider Middle East. But we also have to look at this in perspective. In OECD's reporting in 2024, total aid was about 215 billion. Now, the global GDP was about 111 trillion. So official aid was 0.19% of the global GDP. Now, you can't pick up the global GDP and put it to work in a way in which you want. But it's to get a sense of perspective that less than 1/4% of global GDP funding, that's what was investing in the partnerships to deliver the SDGs, all humanitarian support, and do a great deal of the heavy lifting on climate change adaptation. Now, undoubtedly, those funds saved lives, helped hundreds of millions in their own efforts to escape extreme poverty. That support is also vital to keep people safe worldwide. That's where epidemiological monitoring goes on. We can see this now with the Ebola outbreak in the DRC and in Uganda. Investments in aid keeps people safe everywhere. It's also critical in terms of global food supplies. There are people who are more exposed, but everyone is exposed if it's not the case that there's effective partnerships, respect for rule of law, and basic global partnerships. Now, aid alone could never prevent or resolve a conflict, but as part of a coherent political, economic, and wider strategy, development cooperation has proven that it can reduce poverty, inequality, and help prevent conflict and sustain peace. And building a new understanding of this is important, and that is why in the course of Ireland's EU presidency, which starts this day next week, Ireland will support strategic level dialogue across the EU on the future of development cooperation and humanitarian assistance. We want to engage all of our EU member state partners to think through these challenges and think through how the EU can work collectively and effectively on these issues. And again, you in the GCE sectors, you're absolutely clear that Ireland isn't immune to negative narratives, trends, or influences. And one of the strengths of GCE is communicating the complex. The populist approach is very simple. You point at one thing and you blame it for everything. You try and explain the complex issues behind migration, behind asylum seeking, behind climate adaptation and climate change. You've already lost the room because it is complex. But GCE is that tool. And the work and the strength of the GCE partners, you in the room, is really evident. Thanks for all of the engagement when we did the midterm review in the course of 24 into 25. The embeddedness of GCE and its partnership with ESD in the Department of Education is really critical. Your work engaged with more than 1.7 million people on the island, 2021 to 25, over 210,000 primary school children, and critically 27,000 educators. Thanks to the partnerships, your efforts to work systemically, to think about how to address things over the long term, every teacher is engaging with GCE in the course of their training, and over time, every teacher who's already in the job, through continuing professional development, engages with GCE. There was also an increase in support from 6.3 million in 21 to 9.8 million in GCE since 23, and also a lot of work across our network in Europe. So again, thanks for all of you who've been engaging with the peer review. So Global Education Network Europe has been undertaking a peer review of our GCE strategy, and that's feeding into the successor strategy process. And I think we'll be seeing a lot of each other again next week when Minister of State Richmond will be launching the peer review. But there are challenges that lie ahead, and we are keen to get your engagement. Thanks to IDEA for all of the work in bringing together the different working groups. There's been a series of meetings and consultations over the past couple of weeks. We'll also be opening an online public consultation toward the end of next week for a month, where we can get more of your thinking on what to prioritize. I think we've already got a lot of the content between the close engagement. There are already recommendations out of the midterm review. There'll be recommendations out of the Gini peer review. So I think one of the tasks that's beholden on all of us is to focus and prioritize, because the continuity of action, kind of the urgency of the issue, requires that we do so. Now, we are working from a position of strength. 70% of the Irish population support ODA. The GCE sector and work and related strategies have built really strong and good foundations. In every symposium, engagement with the GCE sector, I'm meeting leaders. These could be educators who've transformed their school, not into GCE as a subject, but GCE as a system. And I think one of the real tasks that we have collectively is how do we reduce barriers to uptake for the utilization of the values and the mechanisms that underpin GCE, but also ESD. Our educators are being hit on every side with 20 new ideas, and they're just trying to get the curriculum delivered. They're trying to get through the day. How can we work to help reduce the tasks so that GCE puts one thing on the desk and takes two things off the desk? So it can be an approach. And there's really positive and inspiring lessons from particularly principals who've imbued it as a leadership system that is informing every part of their school. And it's the same for you who are working in community outreach with youth and adult educators. That systematization is really, really positive and allows us to move from a strong position. So these collective efforts to support and build and maintain critical thinking, to ensure that understanding is reinforced, that wherever we live, we're connected to one another. And how we respond to that realization, that's what's going to define our collective future. So wishing you well in the discussions. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for the partnerships.